Hello, welcome to another episode of Critic Reading Writing. My name is Acto Quason and I am a professor of English at Stanford University. Arundhati Roy's The God of Small Things tells the story of the Ipe family in the town of Ayemenem in Kerala, India. The story is related predominantly from the perspective of Rahel and her fraternal twin brother Estha, and interlaces two time frames. The first unfolds during the course of two fateful weeks in 1969, when they are 7-year-olds and the family is visited for Christmas by Sophie Mol and Margaret Kochamma, their cousin and her mother from London. Sophie Mol drowns in a storm whilst accompanying the twins to the history house across the swollen Meenachal River. The second time frame takes place over a few hours some 23 years later, when Rahel returns from a failed marriage in America to be reunited with her twin brother, who she hears has been returned after being sent away to live with his estranged father following the tragic events of the earlier time frame. The series of incidents that lead to Sophie Mol's death coincide in the earlier time frame with the police beating to death of Velutha, the untouchable lover of Ammu, the twins' mother. Because the children had also grown to love Velutha, his death affects them badly. In the chaotic aftermath of their cousin's death, Estha is tricked by his grand aunt, Baby Kochamma, into answering yes to a seemingly innocuous question posed to him by a policeman at the Kottayam station, where the badly beaten Velutha is being detained. It turns out that Esther answered yes to the question of whether he had been abducted by Velutha. It is Baby Kochamma's accusation that Velutha raped Ammu that had been used earlier by the touchable policeman as an excuse to beat Velutha mercilessly at the history house, where the twins themselves had been hiding after their boat capsized and they lost Sophie Mol. As a consequence of these unhappy events, Esther suffers unspeakable pangs of guilt for the rest of his days, while Rahel, in complete emotional identification with her dizygotic twin brother, is voided of all motivation and is instead filled with a numbing sense of chaos. Thus, as adults, quiet and emptiness come to mark Rahel and Esther's existential responses to the trauma they had experienced as 7-year-olds. We will see how the twins remain trapped in childhood even as adults, and how the novel enacts their sense of abiding innocence through the play with language, which applies both to the represented world of the twins themselves, as well as in the discourse of the third-person narrator. In The God of Small Things, the stories about the deaths of Sophie Mol and Velutha are relayed piecemeal across several chapters and from different starting points. Each instance of retelling provides us with a fragment of the two time frames, as if to incite our curiosity and keep us fixated on unraveling the details surrounding both the twins and their family's trauma. As Emmeline Barnett Nolehitas puts it, the narrative thus stretches in two directions. First, towards the past and reminiscence, then towards the outcome of the story, constantly referred to in proleptic hints that ultimately come together like the pieces of a puzzle. But the focalization of the two deaths through the eyes of Rahel and her brother also serves to give us progressive, if fragmentary, installments on the collapse of their own internal emotional landscapes. We find in the second time frame that the now 30-year-olds replicate the same structure of feeling that was conveyed in the language games of their childhood some 23 years earlier. Even though the distribution of the childhood stories across the two times frames immediately suggests the shape of a Bildungsroman, the traumatic events of their childhood so firmly seal them into a quest for emotional comprehension and relief that theirs becomes not the story of growing up, but rather the teleology of an arrested development. As we shall see later, the arrested development is signaled for us in the distinctive language of the novel, which combines several linguistic quirks in evocative and superbly poetic discourse to maintain the perspective of childhood across the two temporal frames. The novel mimes a childlike tone not only within the predominant focalization through Rahel's perspective when events occur in the vicinity of her and her brother, but also through the omniscient third-person narrator's voice when events and historical information are conveyed that do not necessarily connect to the twins' immediate experiences. The consistency of this linguistic register not only helps to cast a puerile inflection upon the world of the adults, but also reveals the implacable escapism that childhood innocence performs for the twins. In Roy's novel, the hermeneutic of child's play, which effectively shapes both the narrative form as well as the specific structure of memory, is progressively overwhelmed by the grave impositions of history that is shaped by the catastrophic interdiction of politics, the caste system, and the love laws. All these then amount to the distribution of the sensible in the terms outlined by Jacques Rancière in the Politics of Aesthetics. For as Rancière notes, aesthetics itself is the delimitation of spaces and times, of the visible and the invisible, of speech and noise, that simultaneously determines the place and the stakes of politics as a form of experience. The social policing of the boundaries of what is desirable and what is repugnant, of who can be loved and by how much, that we find amplified in The God of Small Things, is also part of what Rancière describes as the politics of the aesthetic, for it entails questions of choice and agency as much as questions of visibility and desire. Even though the novel is consistent in its deployment of a humorous, child-centered linguistic register, by the end, this register reveals itself to be the mark not of plenitude and play, but of melancholy and nostalgia. The consistency of the childlike voice becomes both boon and burden because it shows that the twins are, in a sense, blocked from the full realization of their trauma and stunted in a perpetual juvenility from which there is no end and no escape. Their bodies continue to grow into adulthood, but psychically, they remain trapped in the minds of children. The novel also outlines the limitation of choices that are imposed upon Ammu, the twins' mother. And yet, despite her centrality to the tragic events that unfolds, Ammu is only one of a number of female figures in the novel that have constraints placed upon their freedom of self-expression. To a large degree, the novel illustrates what Lisa Paul says about the representation of women in literature in her essay Enigma Variations: What Feminist Theory Knows About Children's Literature. Women in literature are disproportionately shown as physically trapped in rooms, attics, in their fathers' houses, or in their husbands'. In those enclosed spaces, women go mad or silent, or they die. Roy illustrates all three aspects of the entrapment and deterioration of women in The God of Small Things, but adds another aspect that is more profound for the overall tragedy of the novel. This is the idea that women's entrapment also serves to fundamentally atrophy their character and make them depleted in their capacity for either self-care or the care of others, thus echoing what we saw in our early episode on critic reading writing on Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics. For as we might recall, Aristotle argues that the obstruction of access to worldly goods, which include access to the comforts of philia, both familial and friendly, among other things, then leads to the incapacitation of the capacity for undertaking ethically salient choices, and thus ultimately to suffering and to tragic outcomes. The atrophying of the self is also depicted in the character of Baby Kochamma, who is actively malicious and instrumental in implanting a form of unbearable guilt in the young Rahel and Estha. Baby Kochamma suffers an episode of unrequited adolescent love that then extends into her adulthood. The burden of her loveless life and her permanent residence in her parents' home turns her into a source of ambient menace to anyone she deems to be less fortunate than her, which in the immediate context of the Ipe household means Ammu, Rahel, Esther, and then Velutha. As we shall see, this ambient menace comes to tincture the world of the children and their mother and swells to an active agent of their ultimate destruction as a close-knit unit within the household. The play on the title, The God of Small Things, sets up a series of contrasts between small and big things. This is given specific expression several times throughout the novel, but especially in the statement that the Ipe household is a place where only the small things were said, the big things lurked unsaid inside. Given the fact that the tragedy of the novel is intricately tied to overdetermining processes that go beyond individual characters, while at the same time also coinciding with their personal hopes, fears, and vague ideas, small things and big things may also be transposed onto a somewhat different register of causalities. Big things pertain to large social realities such as caste, religion, patriarchy, and communist politics. These imply deterministic codes that seek to regulate individual behavior and social relations according to imponderable rules that come with attendant threats of punishment and exclusion. For their part, small things reveal themselves mainly in the domain of feelings, emotions, and internal states that color the character's personal dispositions and agendas. The ethically inconsequential individual choices that shape the tragedy may be traced from the domain of small things as they contingently interact with that of big things. Something of the domain distinctions implied by small things and big things is echoed through Larry McCaslin, Rahel's American husband, who signally fails to grasp the significance of the chaos in Rahel's eyes during their lovemaking. As the narrator tells us, he didn't know that in some places, like the country that Rahel came from, various kinds of despair competed for primacy, and that personal despair could never be desperate enough. That something happened when personal turmoil dropped by at the wayside shrine of the vast, violent, circling, driving, ridiculous, insane, unfeasible public turmoil of a nation. That big God howled like a hot wind and demanded obeisance. Then small God, cozy and contained, private and limited, came away cauterized, laughing numbly at his own temerity. Inured by the confirmation of his own inconsequence, he became resilient and truly indifferent. Nothing mattered much. Nothing much mattered. And the less it mattered, the less it mattered. It was never important enough because worse things had happened. So small God laughed a hollow laugh. He climbed into people's eyes and became an exasperating expression. The large scale of big things, which in this case is the chaos of India itself, not only renders the small things of inner life unremarkable, but also threatens to entirely abrogate the possibility of the expression. It is this abrogation that makes the small things climb into people's eyes, registering in them a distant look of bewilderment and despair. This collocation of historical scale and the impossibility of personal expression is instituted as a structuring device within the novel. And it comes to ramify at different levels of its vision of tragedy. Small things are also repeatedly emblematized in the narrative through certain identificatory items or motifs, such as the leaf on Velutha's back that predicts the monsoons, the moth that flutters inside Rahel whenever she feels nervous or unloved, Esther's Elvis Presley puff, Sophie Mol's thimble, Chaco's sky blue Packard, Baby Kochamma's garden, and Mamachi's violin. Each item is incrementally echoed and repeated throughout the narrative so as to create a series of resonances around the individual character that they are attached to. They become for the reader the indices of emotional states. Broader nature, for its part, falls in the domain of big things, but nature's beauty also harbors a volatility that does not subtend human action, but rather seems to fundamentally confound it. When Baby Kochamma goes to America to be trained as a landscape artist and returns with a vengeful and domineering spirit to raise a fierce, bitter garden, the motif of the untended garden attached to her falls within the domain of small things and is in sharp contrast to the larger landscape of monsoon winds, the Ayemenem River, and the thick tropical foliage that for much of the novel provides a backdrop of natural cycles to the unfolding events. This natural cycle later on joins the mess of multiple causalities that coalesce together to shape the tragic events. The God of Small Things plays with the idea of the lush plenitude of the natural environment, but this is only an elusive attribute of nature. For we find that nature seems to bear some responsibility for the deaths of Sophie Mol and Velutha, and that she is far from benevolent. If the God of Small Things invokes the trope of children in a lush garden, it does so not through any direct invocations of peaceful nature, but predominantly through the language games through which Rahel and Esther recreate their sense of the world. Their variant play with the codes of language is a means of corralling language's potential for imagining different possibilities. It is their Edenic practice of renaming everything using the constituent sounds and textures of language, its idiosyncrasies and potential for confusion that signifies both the vitality and pitfalls of any garden figurations we might consider in world literature. The twins' devices for unleashing the inherent possibilities of language are many: palindromes, reverse reading, breaking up of words into constituent sounds, capitalizing words, and assembling fragmentary word lists and anagrams, among others. Significantly, the various language games that the children play apply only to English and not to the Malayalam, which is also a common part of the Ipe household. In other words, the linguistic hybridity in the novel does not apply to the local language itself, as if to suggest that it is English in its inherent hegemony that requires constant dismembering and reconstitution. Crucial to any interpretation of the God of Small Things, however, must be the fact that this play of language applies as much to the diegetic focalization we see through Rahel's perspective as it does to the discourse of the omniscient third-person narrator, as we noted earlier. The suggestion here is not only that the third-person narrative viewpoint is permanently grafted onto Rahel's, but that the essential tenor of Rahel's perspective is consistently ratified throughout the narrative. As we also see with respect to Velutha, in his moment of existential crisis, even he reverts to the device of language discombobulation, which of course we had until then associated with the twins. However, what appears in the earlier narrative time frame of 1969 as a sign of imaginative effervescence can only be interpreted in the later time frame of them as adults as a sign of entrapment. For the uniformity of linguistic register across both narrative time frames and also between the third-person narrator and the child characters through several events in their story suggests that the tragic events that they are part of have sealed them into a world of innocence from which they cannot hope to escape. It is as if Rahel and Esther are permanently restored to the prime moments of their ego constitution. Thus, the narrative's continual return to divulge different aspects of Sophie Mol and Velutha's deaths in a process of enigmatic relays may then be read as a form of narrative repetition compulsion. That is to say, not the repetition of specific details, but of entire structural ensembles tied inextricably to the feelings and emotions of childhood. The predominance of childlike language games at different levels of the text is thus the mnemonic of a quest for wholeness, which of course is unavailable to the twins within the social terms that have been established throughout the narrative. As Barnett Noel Haters, whom we've cited already, also notes, there is for them essentially a tyranny of memory and an identity shaping struggle to live with what happened. All their actions in the later time frame of the novel gravitate around the incapacity to forget. The aim is not so much to reveal a story as to measure the tensions between individual memory and social heritage and history. Their tragedy is their entrapment by the traumatic events in a state of endless repetition through the same devices by which they had attempted to imagine a world of new possibilities by playing games with language. But the social history of which they are ultimately victims has shown that it is implacable in its demands for obeisance. What the policemen do to Velutha as the twins watch in horror in the history house is human history masquerading as God's purpose and revealed to them as a form of necessity. In that sense, the language games that they play from childhood are signifiers of an Edenic plenitude and their capacity to rename their reality by renegotiating all the terms of naming inherent within language only lapses into a form of entrapment once they are rooted through the crucible of tragic events. What several commentators have noted to be the second sexual transgression in the novel, when brother and sister embrace each other as sexual beings and make love, is to my mind the despairing sign of a desire to return to their mother's womb. And because this sexual transgression is entirely private and never revealed to anyone but themselves, it lacks any of the dire social consequences of their mother's love for the untouchable Velutha. Theirs is not the sign of transgression, but rather a retreat into the imagined comfort of "I am not yet born, oh hear me," of Louis MacNeil's declaration in Prayer Before Birth. And this is what MacNeil says: "I am not yet born, oh hear me. Let not the blood-sucking bat, or the rat, or the stoat, or the club-footed ghoul come near me. I am not yet born, forgive me, for the sins that in me the world shall commit. My words when they speak me, my thoughts when they think me, my treason engendered by traitors beyond me, my life when they murder by means of my hands, my death when they leave me." For Rahel and Esther, it is the testament of an arrested Bildungsroman and a tragedy of the transformation of childhood innocence out of the garden and into a prison of memory. Thank you very much. Please remember to check the suggested readings in the episode description. And if you like this episode, remember to give a thumbs up subscribe and share, hit the notifications bell so that you do not miss any upcoming episodes, and enter your comments in the section below. See you next week.